The wind swept harshly down the nearly empty avenue of Maplewood Avenue, the kind that scraped across the skin and carried with it the bitter scent of impending snow. David Thompson, a retired pharmacist in his late 60s, stood behind the counter of his modest neighborhood pharmacy, staring out through the glass door at a figure that had been there for hours. A little girl, maybe 9 years old, sat on the concrete just to the left of the entrance, bundled in a threadbare coat too thin for the dropping temperature. Her knees were drawn to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around them, and in her hands, pressed between her body and the coat, was something wrapped in a faded towel or cloth. At first, David had thought she might be waiting for someone, maybe a parent inside one of the neighboring shops or someone running errands. But she hadn't moved, not for over 2 hours. Occasionally, people passing by slowed down to glance at her, some in curiosity, others in suspicion. One woman had whispered loudly to her friend, "She's been there since lunch. Do you think she's begging?" That word echoed in David's mind. Begging. In this neighborhood, once lively and middle class, but slowly deteriorating, it wasn't unheard of. He had already dealt with a few thefts over the past year. Small, petty things. A pack of gum. Cold medicine. Once, someone had tried to sneak out a bottle of cough syrup. So David watched, cautious and unsure. He had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, but age had made him practical, perhaps even a little cynical. The girl didn't hold a sign. She wasn't approaching customers. She just sat there, silent, motionless, her eyes not scanning the crowd but fixed, strangely, on the entrance of the pharmacy. His pharmacy. From time to time, he stepped away to assist a customer, but every time he returned to front, there she was, like a shadow burned into the edge of his reality. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a young mother with a stroller muttered something about feeling uncomfortable and hurried past. An older man, loyal to David's store for years, came in and commented, "That girl giving you any trouble? Might want to call someone before it becomes a scene." David nodded but didn't move. Instead, he walked back to the counter and sat heavily on the stool behind the register, the girl's image still framed perfectly in the glass. She wasn't causing trouble. Exactly. But something about her silence, her stillness, made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Why hadn't she left? Why hadn't she said anything? It was almost 4 o'clock when David noticed her stir. Slowly, stiffly, she rose to her feet. She didn't look around or brush herself off. Instead, she walked one cautious step at a time toward the glass door of the pharmacy. David's hand instinctively moved beneath the counter, where the emergency phone was kept. Not that he expected danger, but something about this felt off. The way she moved, the way she kept her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if hiding something delicate or dangerous. She stopped just outside the door, not entering, just resting her head lightly against the glass. Her eyes locked on his. Not pleading, not sad, just waiting. David stood slowly. His heart beat a little faster than it had a minute ago. He opened the door a crack, letting in a gust of frigid air. "Hey," he said, voice firm but not unkind. "You all right?" She didn't answer, not even a blink. He tried again. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" Still no answer. She just stared at him, her cheeks flushed red from the cold, her hair tangled and clinging to her face. Then, without a word, she took a small step forward and raised her hands. Slowly, she held them out toward him, palms upward, revealing the bundle she'd been cradling so carefully all this time. David didn't reach out. He just stared, unsure what she was trying to show him. The cloth remained mostly closed, whatever was inside still hidden. Something about her stillness, the way she trembled just slightly as she held it, unsettled him. The door clicked shut between them again as David stepped back inside. He moved the phone. Not out of fear, he told himself, but out of caution. This wasn't normal behavior. Something was wrong, and maybe she needed help. Real help. Maybe this wasn't a theft waiting to happen. Maybe it was something worse. Either way, he couldn't handle it alone. As his fingers hovered over the numbers, he hesitated. Then he looked back. The girl hadn't moved. She was still there, standing motionless, eyes locked on his, the small cloth bundle resting in her hands like an offering. He sighed, phone still in hand. "I'll wait just a few more minutes," he muttered to himself. Just a few. He watched. She didn't blink, didn't step back, just stood there as if time itself had frozen her in place. And then, slowly, the door creaked open again. David's breath caught in his throat as she stepped inside for the first time. The girl's entrance was as silent as her presence on the sidewalk had been. David didn't say anything as she crossed the threshold of the pharmacy, and she didn't speak either. Her shoes were soaked through at the soles, leaving faint, wet prints on the floor as she took 2 tentative steps inside. For a moment, David thought she might finally speak, but instead she stopped in the middle of the aisle, turned slightly toward the counter, and slowly pressed the cloth bundle onto the glass. She didn't open it. She just kept her hands on it, her gaze lowered. There was something about the tension in her shoulders, the way she stood like a statue, that made David's stomach twist in discomfort. He had expected some explanation, a request, a plea, even a breakdown, but none came. Just silence and stillness. David walked out from behind the counter slowly, cautious not to startle her. "Are you trying to buy something?" he asked gently, more out of instinct than expectation. The girl didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. Her fingers, raw and reddened from the cold, curled slightly around the fabric. "I can't help if you don't tell me what you need," he added. No response. Something about the way she kept her hands on that bundle made him pause. His eyes flicked to the security camera above, then back to her. Maybe she was hiding something. Maybe she had stolen something before walking in. He'd seen kids pull that before. But this wasn't bravado or mischief. This was something else. Something far more complicated. David's internal conflict flared. He was a man inclined to panic, but he had spent a lifetime solving problems by protocol, and this was becoming a situation with too many unknowns. He stepped back behind the counter without another word, picked up the receiver, and dialed the non-emergency police line. "Maplewood Pharmacy, yes," he told the dispatcher. "I have a child here, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She's alone, not talking, and acting strange. No, she's not causing a disturbance, but she's been outside for hours, and now she's just here. Something's off." The dispatcher asked him a few standard questions. Description, behavior, whether she seemed hurt. David answered them all, eyes still locked on the girl. She remained frozen by the counter, her little hands unmoving, face expressionless. He ended the call with a quiet sigh and hung up. The police arrived faster than he expected. 2 officers, both middle-aged, one of them a woman with a calm but observant demeanor. David pointed them toward the girl without speaking. She didn't react to their entrance, even as they approached slowly, carefully. "Hi, sweetheart," the female officer said, crouching to eye level. "Can you tell us your name?" Nothing. The girl didn't flinch, didn't blink. The male officer glanced at David. "She hasn't said a word?" David shook his head. The female officer softened her tone. "Honey, we're just here to help. Can you show us what's in your hands?" For the first time since entering the store, the girl moved. Her fingers loosened their grip on the cloth bundle, and slowly, methodically, she peeled it open on the glass counter. Inside was a small plastic container, cracked along one edge, but still sealed. It was filled with coins, pennies, nickels, some dimes and quarters, all worn and dirty. A few bills, too, crumpled almost beyond recognition. Her voice, when it finally came, was quiet and hoarse. "It's all I have," she whispered. "The lady is sick." The store fell into absolute silence. Even the officers paused. David felt a strange pressure in his chest at her words. Not because they explained everything, but because they explained nothing and everything all at once. The female officer tried again, gently. "What lady? Your mother?" The girl gave a tiny nod. Her lip trembled. "She's sick, and she can't get out of bed. I just need the medicine. Please." David stepped forward, unsure of what he even meant to say. "What kind of medicine?" "I don't know," the girl replied, blinking rapidly. "They're round and white, and the box is blue. And there's another one, yellow, small, but it hurts her stomach." The way she described them, shapes, colors, effects, it wasn't the language of a thief or manipulator. It was a fragmented understanding of someone who had been doing her best to remember what she had seen in a medicine cabinet, probably while watching her mother suffer. The officers looked at each other. The male officer finally spoke. "We'll need to take her with us, get more information, maybe get child services involved." David felt something twist inside him. She didn't need handcuffs. She needed help, but still, he knew protocol. And maybe that's what this was, just part of the process. The officers let her out gently, the girl not resisting, though she kept her eyes on the plastic container of coins. The female officer picked it up and carried it out with her. As they stepped outside into the growing cold, David stood alone behind his counter, watching through the window as the girl climbed into the back seat of the patrol car. Her face was unreadable. Not frightened, not angry, just hollow, worn out in a way a child shouldn't be. David leaned heavily against the counter, his fingers curling slightly against the glass where the bundle had been. He had expected trouble. Theft, maybe, or worse. But what he had found was far more uncomfortable. A little girl with a jar of coins and a broken sentence about a sick woman. And that sentence, "The lady is sick," reverberated in his thoughts as he stood in the dimming light of his pharmacy, wondering just how wrong he might have been. Emily Carter sat in a small interview room at the precinct, the unfamiliar fluorescent light glaring off the metal table between her and the social worker, Officer Martinez, and another detective whose badge gleamed faintly in the sterile air. Her hands rested on the table, the plastic jar of coins beside her still sealed, its contents rattling softly every time she shifted. David had left before they reached this place. He had helped contact the social services so that Emily would be cared for, but he couldn't bring himself to stay. All he wanted now was to know what had brought this child to his pharmacy and why she had held that jar as though it contained all her only hope. Emily's eyes were dark and weary, far older than anyone her age should be. When asked to say her name, she swallowed hard and stared at the ceiling before replying, voice low and tremulous. Emily Carter. Asked her age. She placed her fingers together as though counting invisible beads. 9. Detective Harris leaned forward, his tone more gentle than Emily expected, given the room's cold severity. "Emily, can you tell us why you were outside Mr. Thompson's pharmacy today?" Emily picked at a frayed thread on her coat, her gaze flickering toward the jar. I needed to get medicine for my mother. She's very sick. She has lupus, they say." The word came out awkwardly, tentative, as though she was testing on her tongue. Emily had overheard her doctor describe the disease days ago over phone. She didn't fully understand the diagnosis, only that her mother lay in bed, too weak to open her eyes sometimes, trembling when she attempted to stand. She remembered the medication by the small package's sky blue box, and the other by its lemon yellow color, though she could not recall their names. Officer Martinez, with a soft expression, asked, "You been helping your mom for how long, Em?" Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders shaking. "Since she got worse. She used to cook and talk and laugh. But for a long time now, she stays in bed. I bring her water, feed her what I can, but the pills are the hardest." Her voice cracked, and for a moment the jar rattled with her trembling grip. "I collected the coins by selling cans and helping neighbors with small chores. When I thought I had enough, I wrapped them and took them." Detective Harris looked down at his notebook. "Did your mom ask you to go?" Emily nodded faintly. "She told me she needed them. I don't know how to say the names. I just know she points to the bottles when she can, and I know she needs you to bring them." She pressed a palm flat onto the jar, as if it anchored something inside her. "I didn't want to bother your store. I'm sorry if I bothered someone. Her voice trailed off, and she blinked back tears she couldn't let fall yet. The social worker, Ms. Garcia, stepped forward with compassion in her eyes. "Emily, thank you for telling us. You're very brave. We're going to help you and your mom. No one should have to do what you did." Emily's features flickered with relief, followed by hesitation. Will she live? The question was fragile, split open with fear. Ms. Garcia nodded gently, though uncertainty pressed across her face. "Yes, Emily. With proper treatment, she can get better. We'll make sure she gets what she needs." They guided Emily out of the interview room to a waiting area. where she curled on a plastic chair, the jar still clutched in her lap. The door opened unexpectedly, and David stepped in, his face creased with concern. Emily looked up sharply, eyes widening. He knelt beside her, voice quiet. "Hi, Emily. I'm David Thompson. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." She stared, unsure. He cleared his throat. "I helped call the police because I didn't know what to do. I thought you might be in danger. But now, I want to help." Emily released a jar and shoved it into David's unresisting hand, her fingers trembling against the skin. He held it loosely. She pressed her head into his side, and he felt the damp warmth of her small cheek. The social worker stood behind them, watching, nodding. The detective observed quietly, recognizing the human edge to this paper-lace case. Later, after Emily was placed in temporary care with Ms. Garcia, while arrangements were made for her mother's medical treatment, David walked with her to the parking lot. Emily's coat hung loosely around her shoulders, the wet prints of her shoes dark on the tile floor. She looked up at him. "Will you come see her?" David nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, I'll come as soon as I can." He bent and tucked a hand under her chin, straightening her coat, and she nodded faintly before walking across the lot, clutching a small plastic bag with warm food Ms. Garcia had set beside her. David watched until she was gone. Back inside the precinct, Ms. Garcia and Detective Harris conferred. She reviewed notes on Emily's condition and her mother's circumstances. They lived alone in a dilapidated trailer on the fringes of town, electricity unreliable, medical bills mounting. Emily had been stretching her meager fund for weeks, choosing between buying antibiotics and aspirin. No school attendance. She had skipped days to care for her mother. They decided to contact local charities that could provide emergency medicine, and also began the paperwork for Medicaid and utility assistance. David returned to his pharmacy after the day's clouded events. The bell over the door jingled as he entered. The familiar aisle lights dim against the late afternoon gloom. He paused by the counter where the jar of coins had rested earlier, absent now, but its memory remained in the shape of his palm. His eyes shifted to the rows of pills and bottles behind him. The same ones hospital staff had described him in emergency calls, the same colors Emily had mentioned. He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not to profit, but to serve. The pharmacy suddenly felt different, no longer merely a business, but a point of connection, a possible refuge. As dusk settled outside, David whispered to himself, voice barely audible, "We'll help her, every step of the way." And in that quiet promise, the first fragile threads of something profound began to weave. Sleep came only in fragments that night. David tossed beneath his quilt, the familiar creaks of his old house offering no comfort. Long after midnight, he found himself sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty mug of coffee cooling between his hands, replaying every moment of the day. He could still see the girl's eyes, far too solemn for a child, and hear the words she had said in that frail, trembling voice. "She's sick, and she can't get out of bed." David had always been a rational man, trained to look at things through a lens of logic and procedure, but the image of Emily standing barefoot on the pharmacy floor, clutching her jar of coins like a sacred offering, pierced through all that structure. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by medicine, formulas, prescriptions, but nothing he had encountered in his 30 years behind the counter had prepared him for the ache in his chest now. By morning, the choice was no longer something he was weighing. It had transformed into something that simply had to be done. He called Ms. Garcia early, barely waiting for the sun to rise above the edge of the trees. After a brief conversation, she agreed to meet him and accompany him to the trailer where Emily and her mother lived. It was not an official visit, but she knew David's intentions were genuine and grounded in more than just curiosity or guilt. The trailer sat on the outskirts of a rundown RV park, past rusted fences and cracked asphalt roads, far from where city plows kept things clear in the winter. When David pulled up beside Ms. Garcia's car, he noticed immediately how the snow had piled up around the structure, untouched and dense. The roof sagged slightly, and one of the windows had been sealed shut with duct tape. As they approached the door, Ms. Garcia knocked gently. No answer came. She knocked again, firmer this time, and a weak voice called out from inside, "Come in if it's safe." David followed her into the cramped space, where the air was thick with a mixture of stale breath and the faint scent of disinfectant. The trailer was dim, the only light coming from a narrow window partially covered by a towel. In a small bed against the wall lay a woman, thin and pale, her hair matted and her cheeks hollow. She looked up slowly as they entered, eyes flickering with recognition and weariness. "You're from the pharmacy," she whispered, directing the words at David. He nodded. "I am. My name's David Thompson. I own the store where your daughter came yesterday." Her eyes welled, not with tears, but with shame. She shouldn't have gone. I didn't ask her to do that. Not like that. "She didn't steal anything," David said quickly. "She tried to buy your medicine with everything she had. That's not something to be ashamed of." The woman, whose name was Margaret, tried to sit up but fell back, wincing. Ms. Garcia rushed to her side to help adjust the pillows. David scanned the room. An electric space heater hummed in the corner, probably their only heat source. A few cans of food were stacked on the counter. There was no running refrigerator sound, no light overhead. Emily's presence was everywhere. In the folded clothes stacked with child's neatness, the crayon drawings taped to the walls, the labeled pill bottles sitting empty near the bed. "She needs consistent care," Ms. Garcia said gently. "We've filed for emergency medical aid and started the process to stabilize things, but it won't be fast. There's red tape, always." David stepped forward, speaking before he had fully thought it through. "I want to help directly. I don't have family. I'm not a doctor, but I know medications. I can get what you need. I know people at the clinic who owe me favors." He looked at Margaret, his voice softening. "And I think Emily, she needs somewhere safe to go after school. Somewhere warm. Maybe she can come to the pharmacy in the afternoons. Learn a little. Stay out of trouble." Margaret stared at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked quietly, her voice nearly inaudible. David didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted to a drawing above the bed, a crude but sweet depiction of a girl and a woman holding hands in front of sun. He took a breath. "Because someone needs to, and because I think Emily deserves a future that doesn't start and end in a trailer." Margaret looked away, her jaw tightening. Everyone promises something at first. Then they disappear when it gets hard, when the money runs out, when the work gets too much. David nodded. "I've been there too. I know what it feels like to lose people, to stop trusting anyone. I'm not offering a miracle, just a bit of consistency." A silence settled over the room, filled only by the low hum of the heater. Then Margaret closed her eyes briefly, exhaled, and nodded once. That afternoon, David returned to the pharmacy, but this time with purpose. He cleared a corner near the front window, where a display of vitamins used to be. He brought in a small bookshelf, some second-hand children's books from a thrift store, a lamp, and a soft cushion from his home. It wasn't much, but it was something, a place Emily could sit, read, rest. He printed a simple sign, "Emily's Corner," and taped it above the shelf, just temporary until he could make something nicer. By the end of the day, Emily arrived with Ms. Garcia. She looked around, wide-eyed and unsure, her hand clutched tightly in the social worker's. David greeted her with a gentle nod, gesturing to the small corner he'd prepared. "That's for you. You can help out a little after school, learn the ropes, but mostly it's just a place to be." Emily stepped forward slowly, her eyes scanning the books, the cushion, the light. She ran her hand along the edge of the shelf and sat down quietly, picking up a book and holding it in her lap without opening it. For the first time in days, David felt something loosen in his chest. He returned to the counter, serving a customer with a quiet smile. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the pharmacy, warmth had begun to spread, not just from the heater, but from something deeper, something that neither age nor grief nor hardship could extinguish, a sense of quiet, persistent hope. Winter continued its slow retreat from the edges of Maplewood as March settled over the town with melting snowbanks and chilled winds that still bit through coats in the early morning. Inside the pharmacy, the atmosphere had begun to change in ways David hadn't expected. It was subtle at first. One or two regular customers noticed a new bookshelf by the window and the girl who sat near it every afternoon with a notebook in her lap and a pencil always in hand. She never interrupted. She read, she observed, and she wrote. When she was done with her homework, She quietly watched David from behind the counter, studying his every move with the kind of attention adults rarely gave anything anymore. When asked by a few curious neighbors who the girl was, David gave a simple answer: she's learning. Emily had taken to her new routine with silent devotion. Each weekday, after school ended at 2:30, Ms. Garcia or a volunteer from the child support agency would walk her over to the pharmacy, where she stayed until just after 6 o'clock. Sometimes David gave her small tasks, organizing the over-the-counter bottles alphabetically, checking expiration dates on boxes of bandages, or dusting the lower shelves where his knees no longer permitted him to crouch. She didn't complain. She took the work seriously, her tiny frame moving purposefully through each task like it was sacred. The corner where she sat had slowly evolved as well. David had brought in a small table for her writing, a larger lamp with a warmer light, and, after speaking with a friend who taught third grade, a series of science books for children, especially those about the human body and medicine. By early April, a wooden sign appeared above her corner, crafted by one of David's longtime customers who did woodworking as a hobby. It read, "Emily's Corner," in carved, sanded letters, finished with a clear varnish. The man refused payment. "It's for the kid," he had said, wiping sawdust from his jacket. "She reminds me of someone I used to be." It wasn't long before others noticed what was quietly happening in that little store. One day, a middle-aged woman came in, glanced at Emily's Corner, and asked David if he would accept a donation. She handed him a $20 bill and told him to use it for whatever the girl needed: books, snacks, even warm gloves if winter came early next time. David took the bill with hesitation, then placed a small jar next to the register label for the corner. He didn't promote it. He didn't speak about it unless asked. But people noticed. They donated, often anonymously, coins, dollar bills, gift cards to local stores. Some left notes. "For a future, every kid deserves a place to grow. In memory of my daughter, who also loved books." David never brought up to Emily directly, but he made sure she had everything she needed. He bought her a new backpack, not flashy, just sturdy and strong, with enough compartments to hold her growing collection of pencils and paper. He replaced the torn soles on her shoes with a pair of snow boots that still had tags on them. When she tried to protest, her quiet way of saying it was too much, he just smiled and said, "Every assistant needs proper shoes." Emily's mother, Margaret, was also improving, though slowly, with support from social services and a local clinic's volunteer program. She was able to receive weekly visits from a nurse and regular deliveries of the medication she needed. David visited every Sunday afternoon. He brought groceries, medical supplies, and sometimes books. Margaret remained skeptical of kindness, especially the kind that came without conditions, but each week her resistance softened. They began having longer conversations about her past, about how she used to work as a legal secretary before her illness, about the dream she had for Emily. One Sunday, as David stood to leave, Margaret said, "You've done more for us in 3 months than anyone else has in 10 years. He didn't know how to answer that, so he simply nodded and walked out with a strange ache swelling in his chest. Back at the pharmacy, Emily had begun to change, too. She still didn't talk much, but her presence had grown more confident. She asked questions now about how pills were counted, how insurance claims worked, why some medications had names that were hard to pronounce. David started letting her watch when he prepared prescriptions, carefully showing her what each label meant. He printed out blank pharmacy forms and let her practice filling them in. She wasn't just curious. She was focused. Every piece of information she absorbed with purpose, as if building towards something she hadn't yet named. One quiet afternoon, David caught her sketching a drawing of the pharmacy, carefully labeled with each section. He looked over her shoulder and asked, "You planning on buying a place one day?" Emily shrugged and kept drawing. "Maybe," she said softly. "It feels like a place where people get better. I like that." Spring rolled in with budding trees and longer hours of sunlight. On a particularly warm day in May, a local newspaper reporter who had heard whispers of Emily's Corner came by the store, curious about the growing word of mouth around the pharmacy's transformation. David refused a formal interview, but the man left with a few observations and a smile. The next week, a small article appeared in the community section of the paper titled A Corner for Hope, featuring a picture of the sign and a short write-up on how one girl's quiet presence had started something meaningful. People who hadn't visited the pharmacy in years began stopping by. Some brought children, others brought books or supplies. Emily stayed humble, often ducking away from any attention. But one morning, David found a note folded into the donation jar. It was written in a child's careful hand. "Thank you for letting me be someone." He didn't know for certain if Emily had written it, but he had a feeling. He folded the note and placed it in his wallet, next to a photo of his late wife. By Summer's arrival, it was hard to remember what the store had felt like before her. David still ran prescriptions, still managed inventory and handled customers, but everything around him felt fuller, not louder or busier, just more alive. He hadn't meant to build a legacy, but somehow, in the quiet corners of his days, one had started to take shape, and he realized, perhaps for the first time since his retirement from formal practice, that his work wasn't finished, not because he had more medicine to dispense, but because he had more to give, and it had all begun with a little girl outside his door,